Segment 1. The Pyrenean Woodsman, 1818. Europe's Forgotten Wild Man. The story begins not with a modern hiker, not with a DNA test, and not with satellite photography, but with a French ledger written in brown iron gall ink, its pages warped by rural humidity. Dated 1818, catalogued in the archives of a tiny commune on the French side of the Pyrenees, it describes a recurring wild man seen wandering the high forests between Saint-Lary and Vielha. The writing is terse, matter of fact, completely lacking the theatrical flair of folklore. And that is what makes it compelling. The official who recorded the entry, Etienne Miraval, was no fantasist. He handled disputes over goats, land boundaries, and firewood permits. Yet he devotes multiple entries across that summer to a mysterious stranger who appeared repeatedly near woodcutters' camps. He describes the figure as heavily built, shorter than most men but extremely broad-shouldered, covered in thick matted hair, dark around the shoulders and lighter along the forearms, moving with an unusual gait, as if unused to flat land. Barefoot, though the terrain was sharp limestone and broken scree. Not mute, but vocalizing in short, guttural bursts. Not resembling French, Basque, or Aragonese. Most striking is Miraval's note that the being's face was surprisingly human, though arranged in older proportions. The brow more prominent, the chin smaller, the cheekbones heavy. Not grotesque, simply different, almost like seeing a face carved from an older blueprint. Woodcutters reported that it stole cured meat, but not bread. It inspected tools, but never took them. It vanished into the tree line with a confidence that suggested lifelong familiarity with these mountains. When a group of hunters finally attempted to track it, they abandoned the pursuit by midday, citing impossible agility on steep rock. One wrote that the wild man climbed inclines no shepherd would attempt. And then, like so many things in rural Europe, interest faded. The forests grew thicker, the winters harsher, and the region turned its attention to more pressing concerns. Local oral tradition remembers it only faintly. Le homme vell, they called him. The old man. Or sometimes le retournant, the returned one. Today we might call him something else. Something we once thought was long extinct. Something like a remnant. A surviving bloodline from an older world. A Neanderthal. Segment 2. The Siberian Survivor, 1871. The Trapline Encounter. The second account comes from the far side of the world, eastern Siberia, near the upper tributaries of the Aldan River, where winters bury entire valleys in white silence and summer lasts only long enough to remind you that the land isn't trying to kill you on purpose. In 1871, this region was a fractal of taiga, marsh, and broken granite hills, thousands of square kilometers where even seasoned hunters could disappear without a sound. The man behind the sighting, Pavel Andreev, was a trapper from Yakutsk who worked a long winter line alone. His journals, preserved by his grandson and copied decades later by local ethnographers, describe an encounter that still unnerves readers today. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is strangely mundane. Pavel wrote that he was checking a series of sable traps along a narrow canyon when he noticed something unsettling. His traps had been deliberately sprung, but not stolen from. The bait was gone, but the animals had been freed. At first he assumed poachers, but the footprints told another story. In the frozen mud along the creek were bare prints, broad, short, and deeply pressed, as if the walker carried a dense, powerful frame. The stride was long, but the foot shape was unusual. Wide at the heel, with surprisingly strong toe depressions, almost prehensile in their flare. He followed quietly, more curious than alarmed. The trail led to a natural stone overhang, a half-cave created by frost-shattered granite. He smelled smoke first. Not the thick resinous smoke of campfires, but a faint, dry scent as if moss had been burned only briefly. Then he saw it. a figure squatting near the back of the rock shelter, illuminated by a thin shaft of winter light. Pavel described it as stocky, extremely muscular, the torso shaped like a barrel, covered in dense brown hair except for the face, skin weathered to a deep, ruddy tone, a head with a long sloping forehead and powerful brow, eyes pale, almost wolf-like, but undeniably human. Arms slightly longer than those of any Yakut, hanging low at rest. The figure was using a stone flake, sharp and freshly struck, to cut frozen bait meat into strips, methodically, with a level of dexterity Pavel struggled to explain. It worked efficiently, even elegantly, as though stone tools were not primitive to it, but normal, passed down through generations unbroken. Pavel froze. The figure froze. The journals say they regarded each other for 10, maybe 15 breaths. Neither moved. Neither spoke. The creature's breathing was heavy but calm. It did not snarl, did not show fear, did not behave like an animal cornered. Instead, it seemed to evaluate him. Slowly, deliberately, as one intelligent being sizing up another. And then, without urgency, it stood, ducked under the rock's upper lip, and walked away into the taiga. Not running, not panicking, just disappearing between the black trunks of the larch forest, with an ease only lifelong forest dwellers possess. Later, Pavel returned to the spot with his cousin. The tracks were still there, leading away from the shelter, but never returning. The burned moss remained in a faint ash ring. Stone shards littered the ground where the tool had been shaped. And inside the cave was something even stranger, a simple bedding of dry reeds, arranged deliberately, clean, organized, and recently slept in. Pavel never again set traps in that canyon. But his journals end with a final line that ethnographers have noted for years. Whatever he was not a beast. Whatever he was older here than we are. Whether you call it a relic hominin, a relict Neanderthal, or something that never made it into our textbooks, Pavel believed he witnessed a survivor of an older world, one who still walked the forests of Siberia long after his kind was declared extinct. Segment 3, The Appalachian Ridgewalker, 1904. The Night Watchman's Account. If the Pyrenees offer seclusion and Siberia offers desolation, then the early 20th century Appalachian mountains offered something else entirely. A labyrinth of hollows, ridges, and forgotten homesteads where a human being, especially one who wished not to be found, could slip between counties and generations unnoticed. The third account is not from a hunter or frontiersman, but from a man whose entire job involved staying awake when others slept, a railroad night watchman named Edwin York, stationed near a remote section of track outside Wise County, Virginia, in 1904. Railroads at the time were carved through deep forest and ancient hillsides. The watchman's cabin sat beside the track like a single human eyelash on the face of an endless wilderness. York's duty was simple: tend the lanterns, keep an eye out for landslides, and watch for anyone tampering with equipment. Nights were long, lonely, and quiet enough that you could hear a fox trotting across leaf litter 50 yards away. York kept a meticulous logbook, and it's from that logbook, preserved by the small historical society in Wise County, that we get one of the strangest and most consistent descriptions of a creature long whispered about in Appalachian folklore. It began in late autumn. York heard rocks clacking together on the ridge above the tracks. Not tumbling rocks, deliberate knocks, spaced evenly, almost rhythmic. Thinking it was someone trespassing, he climbed up the slope with his lantern held high. From the ridge, he saw a figure walking parallel to the tracks. York described it in a manner both calm and clinical, as though he struggled not to embellish. Shorter and wider than any man he had seen, perhaps 5 feet 2 inches or 5 feet 3 inches, but immensely broad. Covered in dark, coarse hair, not like a bear's fur, but more like a thick human coat gone wild, A large, rounded head with a heavy brow ridge, arms long enough that the hands nearly brushed the knees, moving with a rolling, powerful stride, as if built for slopes more than flat ground. The figure was not skulking, it was not hiding. It was walking a deliberate path, as though following the ridgeline for some known purpose. York called out. His voice echoed. The figure froze for only a moment, then continued walking, never acknowledging him directly. York wrote, "He acted like a man who has lived too long apart from men." On later nights, York heard it again, sometimes at a distance, sometimes close enough that he could hear its breathing, slow and deep. He saw it 3 times over the next month, always between midnight and 2, always walking the same ridge. One night, as winter approached, he followed the ridgewalker's trail in daylight. He found broad footprints in damp soil, too wide for a human, but clearly bipedal. He found stones stacked at intervals, forming small cairns, each placed at the edge of the ridge, as if marking a boundary or a path. York left them undisturbed. The last entry in his logbook mentioning the ridgewalker reads, "Gone tonight, all quiet, tracks covered in frost." He moves on, I suppose. Like us, he has his roads. What makes York's account so compelling is how ordinary it is. He never sensationalized it. He never tried to publish a story. He was a tired man working cold nights, seeing something he couldn't explain but also couldn't deny. To him, it wasn't a monster. It was someone living out a way of life older than the tracks themselves, older than the mountains as we know them. Someone who might have carried the features of a people we believed vanished tens of thousands of years earlier. A ridgewalker, a remnant, a Neanderthal in the Appalachian wilderness.
Segment 4, The Javan Mountain Phantom, 1923, The Dutch Surveyor's Report. Some sightings occur in places defined by isolation and cold. Others arise from mountains older than memory, but this one comes from a land of heat, humidity, and dense, breathing jungle. By the early 1920s, Java, still under Dutch colonial administration, was a complex weave of rural villages, volcanic slopes, and rainforest-clad highlands. Much of the interior remained unmapped, not because it was empty, but because it was alive in ways that resisted measurement. Volcanic ridges, sudden ravines, and tangled bamboo forests swallowed compasses and erased trails overnight. Into this landscape stepped Arjen de Vries, a Dutch geological surveyor tasked with charting a new route between 2 remote settlements in the Bromo-Semeru highlands. His notebooks, archived in The Hague and rediscovered only in the 1980s, include a brief but chilling record of what he called de Bergschim, the mountain phantom. De Vries was not a storyteller. His reports were technical, dry, even tedious. Rock density tests, soil stability, rainfall measurements. So when he deviated, when he described something not geological, it stands out starkly. According to his notes, on June 14, 1923, de Vries and 2 Javanese porters were climbing a narrow volcanic ridge at dawn. The heat was already rising. The air shimmered with moisture. As they rested, one porter pointed silently toward a clearing below, a small plateau where the jungle thinned into grass. There, moving with slow, deliberate steps, was a figure unlike any the men had seen. De Vries observed through his survey scope, capturing details he attempted to rationalize but could not fit into any known category. A compact, incredibly muscular frame, perhaps 4 feet 10 inches to 5 feet tall. Limbs thick and strong, especially the forearms. Skin dark and weathered, hair clinging in coarse patches along the arms, legs, and chest. A broad, flattened nose and heavy brow. Head slightly forward-leaning, as though the neck muscles were built for climbing. Walking upright, but with a unique gait, smooth, quiet, as if absorbing shock like an animal adapted to slopes. The porters whispered a name de Vries recorded phonetically as Orang Pendek Besar, not simply the local small humanoid creature sometimes reported, but a larger, rarer, much older variant, known only in fragments of oral tradition. De Vries watched as the figure knelt beside a fallen log and used a stone tool, a flake of volcanic glass, to pry open insects and roots. The tool was not crude. It was expertly knapped, symmetrical, sharp, used with practiced precision. Then came the moment that convinced De Vries he was witnessing something truly extraordinary. The figure paused, stood up straight, and sniffed the air. Slowly, deliberately, it turned, not toward the men, but slightly away, as if sensing only the faint trace of them on the wind. Then it moved into the bamboo thicket in 3 powerful strides and vanished completely. Later, at the village where he lodged, De Vries asked elders about the creature. They were reluctant, evasive, but one eventually spoke. "Some people came before us, not people like us, people of the deep forest. They do not want trouble. They move away when we draw near." "Do they still live?" De Vries asked. The elder shrugged. "Forest is big." De Vries never published the account. It remained scribbled between density measurements and topographic sketches until his death. But his description, especially the knapped volcanic glass tool, found nowhere else in regional fauna, aligns uncannily with known Neanderthal tool-making behaviors. A hominin surviving in the high jungles of Java? Impossible, according to textbooks. But the ridge where De Vries stood that morning felt older than textbooks, older than anything humans claim to understand. Sometimes the forest keeps its oldest residents hidden. Sometimes they let themselves be seen, just long enough to remind us they never left.
The 5th account comes from a place where winter defines not just the season, but the rhythm of every living thing. Northern Manitoba, 1938, long before radar stations, long before ice roads, long before anyone imagined the Arctic as charted terrain. Back then, the Northern Barrens were almost mythic. A place where caribou moved like rivers, storms built themselves out of nothing, and distances deceived even those who lived there. The best records from this region came not from scientists, but from fur trappers, Cree and Dean hunters, and the occasional bush pilot who risked the cold for mail runs. And it was one such trapper, Samuel Utek, a quiet, meticulous man from the northern Cree community near Reindeer Lake, who left behind an account still whispered about in his family generations later. Utek's journals were written in syllabics and translated years afterward by his daughter. The entry for February 12, 1938, stands out: "Not bear, not wolf. Walked like a man, but feet wrong. The day began like any other. Utek was traveling his trap line along a frozen drainage valley, a place where wind polished the snow into glass-like sheets. He noticed immediately that something had disturbed the line. Several traps were sprung, but the bait remained untouched. Instead, whatever had passed through had simply inspected them. Then he saw the tracks, broad, short, deep, bipedal, splaying slightly at the toes as if the foot were built for gripping uneven ground, but here, pressed confidently into hard Arctic snow. The stride was long, but not human long. It was powerful, intentional, and consistent in a way that made Utek uneasy. He followed the tracks for nearly a kilometer until he reached a shallow ravine where the snow had drifted deeply. There, protected from the worst of the wind, he found something extraordinary. A crude shelter. Not a cabin or a tent. Nothing so modern. Just a carefully woven half-dome made of willow branches, snow blocks, and hides stretched across an inner frame. What struck him most was the shelter's design. It resembled no Cree or Dean structure, nor any Inuit Karmak. Instead, it seemed improvised from available materials, built by someone who understood survival, but not in the way any known people did. Inside, he found the remains of a small fire, a scattering of bones cracked for marrow, a pile of moss and caribou hair arranged neatly, like bedding, and, most unsettlingly, a heavy stone scraper, smoothed by long use. As he studied the tracks inside the shelter, Utek wrote, "Feet like man's, but wider. Heel big, toes strong. Walks straight, heavy." Nearly an hour passed before he felt it. a presence, an instinctive tightening in the air, the way you know a bear is near long before you see it. He turned. At the top of the ravine, partially obscured by blowing snow, stood a figure. Not large like a giant, not tall like a myth, but thick-bodied, about the height of a small adult man, with proportions that defied expectation. Broad chest, powerful neck, arms slightly too long, silhouette softened by dense fur or hair. It didn't move toward him. It didn't flee. It simply watched, breathing in slow clouds that merged with the drifting snow. Utek felt no aggression, only caution, and a strange, almost human curiosity. He slowly backed away, leaving the shelter undisturbed. When he glanced back from a distance, the figure had vanished as quietly as it had appeared, footprints already half erased by the wind. That night, back at his cabin, he wrote the line that caused later ethnographers to pause. Old people walk still. They stay on the ice line where the land is wide and no one bothers them. The implication was clear. Whatever Utek saw was not a bear walking strangely, not a lost traveler, not a misremembered encounter. It was something older, something adapted to the cold long before modern humans ever reached the northern plains. A remnant hominin, a survivor on the edge of the world, a Neanderthal who never left the quiet line between forest and ice. Segment 6. The Anatolian Shepherd's Tale, 1951. The Stone Valley Pursuer. Some sightings occur in frozen silence, others in humid jungle heat. But this one comes from a landscape carved by time, stone, and shepherding traditions older than recorded history. Central Anatolia, 1951. In the rugged hills east of Sivas, where volcanic plateaus give way to rolling grasslands and eroded canyons of tufa and basalt. Shepherds here lived lives scarcely changed in centuries, moving their flocks between seasonal pastures and sleeping in small stone huts built by their grandfathers. The account comes from Kemal Yilmaz, a young shepherd at the time, whose story was recorded decades later by a regional ethnographer documenting Anatolian oral histories. Kemal was not prone to exaggeration. His life revolved around sheep, dogs, and weather patterns. But what he encountered one spring morning in 1951 became a story he could never quite explain, though he never embellished it either. Kemal's flock had moved deep into a narrow valley known locally as Tash Dere. Stone Valley. The walls here rose steep and weathered, carved by millennia of wind into narrow shelves and crooked ledges. It was a perfect place for goats, less ideal for sheep, and a nightmare for predators. But Kemal relied on his 2 Kangal dogs, both seasoned guardians, fearless against wolves. On that day, the dogs stopped suddenly, not barking, freezing. Their bodies went rigid, noses lifted, ears forward. Not wolf, not bear, something else. From the ledge above came the sound of pebbles striking rock, not falling accidentally, but dislodged by deliberate movement. Kemal looked up, expecting to see a thief or wandering traveler. Instead, he saw a shape stepping lightly along the ledge, bipedal, compact, and unusually broad. He described it as short but immensely sturdy, no more than 5 feet tall. Chest wide and barrel-like, arms long and powerful, hair covering much of the limbs and torso, but thinner on the face. Skin darkened not by sun but by age and weather. A heavy brow giving the eyes a deep-set, shadowed look. Feet bare, gripping the rock with remarkable agility. The creature moved in a way both familiar and alien, upright like a man, but balanced with animal-like certainty, navigating steep ledges without hesitation. As it paced above, it watched the flock intently, head tilting slightly with each movement, as though calculating. The dogs growled now, deep, uneasy. The creature didn't flee. Instead, it made a soft, rapid clicking sound with its tongue. Rhythmic, patterned, almost communicative. It echoed faintly down the stone walls, startling the sheep into a tight cluster. Kamal shouted, waving his staff. The figure paused. Then it did something that chilled him to his core. It tossed a stone, not randomly, but deliberately, landing it near the front of the flock, not close enough to hit, just close enough to test their reaction. And then again, and again, each stone placed with a strange precision, as if the creature were gauging the animal's movements, their fear, their speed. Kamal realized with sudden clarity, this was a predator, but not in the way any wolf or bear was. It wasn't attacking, it was studying, testing, learning. When Kamal and the dogs moved toward the ledge, the figure retreated with fluid ease, climbing a nearly vertical section of stone using both hands and feet. It reached a higher shelf, paused once more to look back, then vanished into a cleft in the canyon wall. Gone, as if it had melted into the rock. Kamal reached the spot minutes later. There was no path, no handholds, nothing a normal human could climb, but on the dusted stone surface he found prints. Broad, flat, bare. Toes splayed wide like strong, gripping instruments more suited to uneven stone than flat soil. The village elders dismissed the story publicly, but privately acknowledged something they called Tash Adam, the stone man, a figure spoken of only in hushed tones, a remnant of old times, a being that watched from cliffs and vanished before one could get too close. Kamal never saw the Stone Valley pursuer again, but he always insisted it wasn't a spirit, nor a monster, nor a hallucination of heat and isolation. It was a man, he said, just not a man from our world anymore. A survivor, a relict, a Neanderthal shaped by stone and solitude. Segment 7. The Vietnam Highlands Encounter, 1969. The patrol that wasn't alone. War zones are strange places for sightings. People expect chaos, fear, misidentifications born from exhaustion. But some encounters stand out precisely because the witnesses were trained not to panic, not to embellish, and not to misread what was right in front of them. This account comes from the central highlands of Vietnam during the wet season of 1969, when dense montane forests and razor-edge ridgelines made visibility nearly zero, even at midday. These were regions where mist hovered perpetually, where every sound was swallowed by foliage, and where even experienced trackers struggled to distinguish human footsteps from the shifting weight of rain-soaked branches. A 5-man reconnaissance patrol, 2 Americans, and 3 Montagnard scouts, was moving along a narrow ridge west of Kon Tum province. The group's purpose was simple: map enemy trails and observe troop movement. But what they encountered that morning didn't belong to any known unit, faction, or species. The account is preserved through the personal journals of Corporal James Red Halperin, later corroborated by interviews with one of the Montagnard scouts, Y. Bo, conducted in the early 2000s. Halperin's entry begins with the same unusual calm found in many authentic sightings. Saw something today, don't know what to call it. The patrol had halted after hearing soft rock taps, steady, rhythmic, deliberate. Not gunfire, not animals, a signaling method used by no known force in the area. The Montagnards froze immediately, hands raised for silence. Something or someone was pacing the slope below them. They first saw a shadow moving between the giant dipterocarp trees, slipping effortlessly from trunk to trunk. Then the shape emerged into partial view as the fog thinned for a brief moment. Halperin described it as shorter than a man, but powerfully built, perhaps 4 feet 8 inches to 5 feet 0 inches. Shoulders massively wide, torso thick. Arms unusually long, hanging well past the waist. Body covered in coarse dark hair, dampened by mist. Face broad, heavy-browed, with a forward posture suggesting immense neck strength. Eyes small but deeply intelligent, constantly scanning the forest. It moved neither cautiously nor aggressively. Instead, it walked along a series of narrow terraces carved into the hillside. Paths no soldier would choose, too exposed and too slick. but the creature navigated them with absolute confidence, using its long arms to steady itself when needed. Ibo whispered a word Halperin didn't recognize at the time, Ke-Lolu, later translated as the forest older brother. The creature paused, sniffed the air, then made a low, rhythmic, throaty sound. Not a growl, not a call, but something between speech and breath. It repeated this twice before picking up a long, straight branch and tapping it softly against a rock outcrop. Tap, pause, tap, tap, a pattern. The scouts stiffened, not in fear, in recognition. They signaled back with a low whistle, used only by certain indigenous groups to announce peaceful presence. The creature stopped, turned its head. Then, in a fluid, almost balletic motion, it slipped into a concealed cleft between tree roots and vanished so quickly that Halperin initially thought it had dropped into a pit. But the Montagnards explained that the highland forests were full of hidden crawl spaces, tight, natural tunnels formed by centuries of erosion and root systems. Later, as the patrol continued along the ridge, the creature shadowed them from below, just out of sight, just close enough to hear. Branches shifted softly. Occasional taps echoed. Not once did it behave like a predator or a threat. It seemed simply curious, tracking them the way one might track unfamiliar travelers passing through ancestral land. At camp that night, one scout silently placed a small bundle of herbs near the fire, an offering of respect for old forest beings. Not spirits, not myths, living, breathing beings. Halperin's final line in that entry remains the most haunting. If that thing is a legend, it is a legend with lungs. And it's older than this war, older than this country, older than us. What were they dealing with? Not an ape, proportions wrong, behavior too deliberate. Not a local tribe, height, hair coverage, and gait mismatched entirely. Many modern researchers now suggest the possibility of a relict hominin, perhaps a dwarf offshoot, perhaps a regional remnant adapted to dense forests long after the last glacial age, or perhaps an echo of a lineage we once met in Europe and believed extinguished. A Neanderthal who exchanged ice for jungle and survived in silence. Segment 8. The Caucasus Cave Dweller, 1974. The Border Patrol discovery, there are places in the world where mountains do more than rise. They divide. Places where the terrain itself becomes a border, a rift, a wall between civilizations. The Caucasus Mountains, 1974, were one such place. Cold, jagged, labyrinthine, and carved by rivers that seemed as old as human memory, the region was patrolled heavily, not because of wildlife, but because it sat along tense geopolitical lines. Soviet border units scoured the ridgelines for smugglers, defectors, and anyone venturing where they shouldn't. But one patrol's discovery that spring wasn't a man fleeing across the frontier. It wasn't a hermit. It wasn't even a known primate. It was something much older. The account originates from now declassified field notes and an interview conducted in 1991 with a retired border guard named Sergeant Alexander N. Tkachuk, whose recollections remained remarkably consistent across decades. In April 1974, Tkachuk and two other soldiers were tracking what they thought were illegal poachers moving through the foothills near the Dagestan-Georgia border. Snow still clung to shadowed valleys, and the wind carried the smell of thawing earth. The men followed a narrow gorge toward a limestone cliff where meltwater dripped rhythmically into a shallow creek. That's when they found the prints. Not boot prints, not barefoot human prints. These tracks were broad, square-shaped, with powerful toe impressions and a deep heel strike, far deeper than any normal person would leave in the semi-frozen soil. The stride was too short for a tall human, but too heavy for a small one. One guard muttered, "Medved, bear." But Tkachuk shook his head. Bears don't walk in a straight, confident line, and they certainly don't leave bare footprints. The tracks led toward a small cave entrance, half concealed by thorn shrubs and limestone rubble. The men approached cautiously, rifles raised, expecting a smuggler's hideout. What they found stopped them cold. The interior of the cave was tidy, organized, and unmistakably inhabited. Inside were a bedding pile of dried grass and woven branches, a ring of soot where small fires had once been lit, several stone tools, scrapers, cutting flakes, and blunt hammerstones, bones cracked open for marrow, sorted into distinct piles, and on the wall, faint but unmistakable charcoal marks, arranged in short, deliberate strokes, almost like tally marks or primitive symbols. Then came the sound, breathing, heavy, slow, from deeper in the cave. Tikachuk moved his flashlight beam toward the sound, and for a brief, unforgettable moment, the light caught the creature's outline. He later described it as short, barrel-chested, and powerfully built, covered in coarse dark hair except for the face, skin pale beneath the hair, as though it rarely saw sun, a broad nose, deep-set eyes, and an unmistakably heavy brow ridge. Hands large and thick-fingered, one resting on the cave wall for balance, a posture slightly forward-leaning, but firmly upright, eyes reflecting the light with a steady, intelligent focus, not animal panic. The creature froze, not in fear, but in calculated assessment, as if deciding whether the three men were a threat or merely intruders. One guard whispered a curse. Another began to raise his rifle. Tikachuk quickly placed his hand on the barrel and forced it down. The creature took a slow step backward, deeper into the darkness, then another, and then it was gone, retreating through a narrow fissure no human could squeeze through. The men searched the outer cave but found only the tools, the bedding, and the strange charcoal marks. The official report typed up later sanitized the details, stating only, "Cave used by unknown trespasser. No subject found." Privately, Tikachuk kept a journal where he wrote a single line that he never dared share with superiors. Not a man, not an animal. Something in between. Something from before. Modern paleoanthropology reveals that the Caucasus was once a crossroads, a place where Neanderthals, Denisovans, and early modern humans overlapped in time and space. The mountains preserve secrets exceptionally well. The cold slows decay. The caves protect whatever finds refuge within. Could something have survived into the 20th century? A relict population in deep mountain caverns? A living representative of a lineage we thought ended 40,000 years ago? Tikachuk believed it until the day he died, and he insisted that what he saw in that cave was no myth, no hallucination, no folklore. It was a survivor, a cave dweller from an older world, a Neanderthal standing in the beam of a Soviet flashlight. Segment 9. The Patagonian Shadow Walker, 1987. The Lonely Road Incident. Some lands are so vast, so sparsely inhabited, and so wind-scoured that they erase the very idea of being watched. Patagonia is one of them. Even in the late 20th century, great stretches of the Argentinian steppe and Andean foothills were as empty as the moon. Rolling plains of scrub grass, volcanic boulders, old shepherd roads, and wind that never stopped moving. And it was on one of those roads, in 1987, that a truck driver named Rodolfo Rudy Salvatierra encountered something he never spoke of publicly, not until years later, when he told his adult son in a shaky voice over mate on a cold winter night. Rudy had been hauling wool bales from a remote estancia near Perito Moreno to the coastal town of Puerto Deseado. It was just past midnight. The night was star-filled, bitterly clear, the Milky Way bright enough to cast faint shadows. His headlights swept across the barren land, illuminating nothing but the occasional guanaco and the ghostly silhouettes of solitary trees twisted by decades of wind. Then he saw movement on the shoulder of the road. At first he assumed it was a shepherd walking home from a late round, but as the truck drew closer, the figure's proportions snapped into startling clarity. Rudy slammed the brakes. The figure stood in the light for just an instant, illuminated, raw, unmistakable. He described it as short and extremely muscular, maybe 4 feet 10 inches to 5 feet 0 inches, neck thick, shoulders massive, chest like a compact athlete, arms long, reaching nearly to the knees, body covered in coarse, wind-tangled hair, face broad, low-browed, with a protruding nose and deep-set eyes, an odd forward-leaning posture, as if designed to move efficiently against the wind. Barefoot, toes gripping the gravel shoulder with strange confidence. Rudy said the sight of it triggered no instinctual monster response, only a cold, analytical shock that something stood there which did not match any known category in his mental catalog of humans, animals, or folklore. The creature didn't flee immediately. Instead, it tilted its head. Not like an animal, like a person trying to understand a machine's behavior. Then, it stepped off the shoulder into the scrub. Not running, not stumbling, just melting into the darkness. Rudy grabbed his flashlight and stepped out, his boots crunching in the gravel. The truck's diesel engine idled behind him, the only sound aside from the wind. He swept the beam across the low shrubs and basalt rocks. That's when he noticed something else. A second set of eyes, low to the ground, watching. The beam caught the creature just as it crouched perfectly still, maybe 10 meters away, its face partially obscured by tall grass, eyes reflecting pale yellow. But what unnerved Rudy most was its stillness, absolute, controlled, like a hunter who had learned to become invisible. Then it slipped sideways, one smooth movement, and the eyes vanished. Rudy found tracks the next morning, after sleeping in the cab with the doors locked. The prints were wide and short, toes spread for balance, and pressed deeply into soil that a normal person's bare foot wouldn't dent. Tracking in a straight, purposeful line toward a cluster of basalt boulders. He followed the trail only a short distance before finding a sheltered hollow containing a nest-like bedding of grass and guanaco wool, several cracked bones, 2 roughly shaped stone flakes, and a small pile of rounded stones stacked deliberately. Local Mapuche folklore includes mentions of the Trempulcahuechicos, small, human-like mountain wanderers living in the shadows of the Andes. Most interpret the stories metaphorically, but Rudy Salvatierra never again doubted the literal possibility. In his notes, he scribbled a line he never showed anyone until much later. It looked like a person from an older story, a human shaped by wind and stone, not by towns. And perhaps that's exactly what he saw, a night walker of the Patagonian plains, a remnant of a lineage that once crossed ice bridges and mountain passes, surviving into the late 20th century by slipping between the spaces humanity rarely looks, a Neanderthal in the half-light of a lonely road. Segment 10. The Norwegian Snowfield Runner, 2002. The Mountaineer's Final Photograph. Of all the sightings in this documentary, murky, distant, half-lit by lanterns or firelight, only one comes with something close to physical evidence. It happened on a snowfield. It happened in broad daylight. And it happened in 2002, decades after most people assumed such encounters belonged to folklore or frontier myths. The final account comes from Jørgen Amundsen, a Norwegian mountaineer and retired military biathlete who spent much of his later life exploring the high ridges and frozen valleys of Jotunheimen National Park, a place whose name literally means home of the giants. It remains one of the most rugged landscapes in Scandinavia, with remote plateaus where snow lingers year-round and human presence thins to nothing. According to Jørgen's climbing partner, who later shared the story with park authorities and eventually with documentary researchers, the two men were traversing an isolated snowfield between Glittertind and Veobreahesten on a bright March morning. The air was perfectly clear, windless, a rare crystalline silence. They were ascending a gentle slope when Jørgen stopped abruptly. He said only, "Someone's running." At first his partner thought he meant another skier or climber, but then he saw it too, a figure crossing the snowfield hundreds of meters away, moving diagonally across the slope with astonishing speed. The distance was far, but the clean white snow framed every movement with surreal clarity. The figure was short in stature, possibly under 5 feet tall, broad-shouldered and thick through the torso, arms swinging long and powerful, head slightly forward, posture efficient for uphill movement. Covered in what looked like dense winter hair or insulated hide, blending into the surrounding winter landscape. Bare limbs visible, yet entirely untroubled by the cold. But it was the gait, the movement, that froze them in awe. The creature ran uphill at a pace no unassisted human could match, maintaining balance and speed on icy terrain where even experienced mountaineers must tread carefully. Jürgen, with his decades of military biathlon training, shook his head in disbelief. No man can run like that on snow. The figure paused only once, turning its head briefly toward the two men. The distance was too great to see its face clearly, but the proportions were unmistakable. Then it resumed its climb, disappearing behind a rock outcrop. The men stood in silence for nearly a minute, unable to process what they'd seen. And then Jürgen, with a sudden urgency, pulled out the small digital camera he carried during climbs. He zoomed in on the outcrop and snapped several photos as the figure crested another ridge farther away. One photograph, the clearest of the series, shows a tiny, distant silhouette against the snow, but the proportions are wrong for any known winter traveler. The long arms, the short but massive frame, the odd curvature of the spine, the distinctly non-human efficiency of movement across cold terrain. Jürgen reviewed the photos that night at the lodge. He grew quiet. According to his partner, he said, "It wasn't a myth. It wasn't a trick of distance. It was an old kind of human. A snow runner. From before our time." 2 months later, Jürgen died in a climbing accident on a separate expedition, one unrelated to the sighting. His camera, however, was recovered with all images intact. The photograph remains privately held by his family, shown only to a handful of researchers. Its existence is not proof, but it is not nothing. The snowfield runner remains one of the most intriguing modern cases of a creature behaving as if perfectly adapted to cold, altitude, and ice. Traits associated with certain high-latitude hominins we know existed long ago, including some close cousins of Neanderthals whose fossils have since been found in Eurasia. Could one lineage have persisted in Europe's last wild mountain fortress? Amundsen believed it. His partner still believes it. And the photograph, grainy, distant, impossible to dismiss outright, remains a quiet reminder that extinction is not always as complete as we assume. Some beings do not vanish, they retreat, they adapt, and they run across the snowfields where no one expects to see them.